Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel, and welcome to Quantum Froth Dispatches. This is episode like 32 or something. I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we get going. I've been pretty incredibly busy with some really cool opportunities popping up, and but we'll be jumping back into our normal format. We will have, I've got some stuff on Tron and Tron Legacy coming up. It's going to be kind of a deep dive, not as deep as The Wrath of Khan and Conan the Barbarian, obviously. But we'll be talking about that. We've got some world building stuff coming up. We've got a couple of interviews with one with Claire Fishback, whose book release is coming out in June. So that's going to be pretty cool. I just got back from FanX in Salt Lake City a couple weeks ago. I had the distinct pleasure of being on a panel with Brandon Sanderson, which was really cool. And Brian McClellan, I'm sorry I butchered his name. He does like the Powder Mage stuff, which is really awesome. So that was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I was at the Bard's Tower, ran into some people who, friends of the Long War show who stopped by, and we were able to talk some 40K and stuff and everything too. So that was a lot of fun. Coming up at the end of this month, at the end of May, I am recording this at what could be considered either an extremely late hour or a very early hour, depending on your point of view. But yeah, at the end of May, I will be on 2 panels at Denver Pop Culture Con, because they're not allowed to use Comic-Con anymore. So it's going to be, the first panel I think is on Friday, like one at 11. I'll have all these posts on social media too, in case you're going to Denver Pop Culture Con and are interested. But it's like at 11 o'clock in the morning, and it is about the Matrix, whether or not it's still relevant 20 years later. So should be a great panel. And then I have another panel, which I'm really, really looking forward to, on Sunday, about villains and how they're the heroes of their own story, and how much that makes a difference when you have a really good villain, whether or not they're sympathetic or whether or not they're mustache twirlers with no realistic motivation. You know what I mean? So, and I apologize on this podcast. I am recovering from a cold. So if you hear some gaps or something, that's probably me muting out some coughing fits or something like that. So, all right. Well, without further ado, let's jump back into Star Trek. 5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. There is, I don't know what you'd call it, like a meme, I guess, or a legend, or probably not a legend. A rule, right? A pop culture rule that says that the even-numbered Star Trek movies are really good, and the odd-numbered Star Trek movies suck. And I'm going to have to go ahead and disagree with that for a number of different reasons. I mean, Star Trek the Motion Picture, obviously odd-numbered, may have left people disappointed, but it's not a bad film. Robert Wise does a really good job with that movie. It's not a bad film. It is dated. If you re-edited it nowadays and removed a lot of the glory shots of the Enterprise and everything, it would probably play better. Star Trek V is bad. I'm not going to even argue that, right? It is not one of Trek's best outings. it is kind of the one that proves that rule. But there are other ones that, First Contact, sorry, I'm not a fan of that movie. A lot of it doesn't make sense. It feels like two films that were completely disjointed, one about the Borg and one about Zefram Cochrane and First Contact. It feels like two separate films that they were just like, we can't reach a compromise. Let's make both. And tonally, they're completely different. And again, Trek falls into the habit of having a new character telling a member of the crew that we've known for years at this point what they're doing wrong. And I did not care for that film. And then you can't honestly tell me that Nemesis was a good film. So, and that's another even one, right? I think that's the 10th of the Star Trek films. I might be wrong about that. But it's had some stinkers. You have Insurrection is in there. It is an odd numbered film. But on this podcast, I want to talk to you about one of my absolute favorite odd numbered Star Trek films. And I think it's if that rule is true, this is the one that breaks that rule. It's the exception. And it is Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. And we're not going to do a deep dive on these. I'm going to talk about Star Trek 3, and I'm going to talk about Star Trek 4, the one with the whales, which is why I called this one, because a lot of people honestly don't even know that one is called The Voyage Home. They literally refer to it as the one with the whales. And the reason why I want to talk to those two films is because they tie in directly to Star Trek 2. Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan, set some events in motion that are only resolved by the end of The Voyage Home. And I might even argue, if you've been following along with the headcanon that I've been proposing, that the events of Space Seed were covered up and it only really came to light, at the beginning of Star Trek 3, at the end of Star Trek 2, that the events set in motion in Space Seed aren't entirely resolved until The Voyage Home. So that's why I felt if we were doing a really deep dive on Star Trek 2, we really can't just stop when the credits roll. We have to press on and investigate what the consequences of that film were, both in a meta sense, on the Trek franchise film as a whole, and story-wise, where did these characters go? And so that's what we're going to talk about on this podcast. Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, and Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. So perhaps to save time, I should just say that every time I say Star Trek 3, I do not mean J.J. Abrams' Star Trek Beyond. I mean Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. So that's probably going to save a little bit of time there. Now, before we get into, Star Trek 3, we do have some ends to tie up with Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan. So arguably Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan is the most successful Star Trek film ever made. As far as story-wise go, it is not the most box office. It is not the most lucrative. It might not even be everyone's favorite, especially in light of some of the newer films with Trek fans that did not grow up with the original cast. They may enjoy the newer films more. But essentially, Paramount has been trying to remake Star Trek 2 since Star Trek 2 came out. So they've just been remaking it, or trying to. And to quote James Kirk, like a poor marksman, they keep missing the target. But I'm just going to roll through some villains that are really, really close to Khan. We have Soren in Generations, we have Rolfo in Insurrection. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I only saw that movie once, and I mentally checked out of it when Data said something about being a flotation device. That's all I remember of the film. Shinzon in Nemesis. played by Tom Hardy, which is insane when you think about it now, right? And Nero in the new films, right? They're all kind of like trying to be Khan and not really making it. And then, of course, you have whoever Benedict Cumberbatch was playing, I can't remember, John Harrison, right? And he, of course, is reprising the role of Khan in I don't know what was in their heads when they cast that role. I mean, Benedict Cumberbatch is amazing, but yeah, he's not Khan Noonien Singh, and not that anyone's asked me, but if I was actually doing that story, you've got a whole universe to play with, so why remake the film? Just start off with the same event, maybe, of the Botany Bay and stuff like that. And instead of having him be Khan, have him be John Harrison and trying to do different things, and everything would go differently instead of just going, oh, this time Kirk gets stuck in the warp drive and kicks it back into shape, because creativity, right? So anyway, I'm not going to harp on JJ too much, but in any case, they've been trying to remake this movie, a half a dozen times, and it keeps failing. They can't catch that magic. And tonight, when we talk about Star Trek 3, we're going to talk about another event that they keep trying to go back to, and it's not earned. And that's part of the reason why it doesn't work. And the event I'm referring to is the destruction of the USS Enterprise. In Star Trek 3, it works because it's earned. And at other times, it's not earned. It's just kind of like, well, we either need a new Enterprise design, like in the Star Trek film, or, we just, it's just they're trying to milk that emotion, but it's just not there. One of the reasons I didn't include like General Chang as a Khan clone, or Krug, who we're going to talk about tonight, is they are not Khan clones. They're actually very different. Krug is ambitious in a way that Khan is not. Khan does have ambition, but it's fulfilled. He doesn't need to become a superhuman Superman dictator. He's been there. He's done that. He got that t-shirt. He's already, kind of the Superman. So he doesn't need to do that. Same with General Chang. General Chang is at the top of his game. And he's like one of the top leading military minds of the Klingon Empire. So he's not playing a revenge game or anything like that. He's playing a completely, he's playing, 3D chess. He is a worthy adversary, but he's not a Khan clone. And one of the reasons why I point these other folks as Khan clones is because Khan had kind of a super weapon, right? He had Genesis, the WMD kind of super weapon thing, even though it wasn't considered a weapon in Star Trek II. It was really a really good force for good that could also be used for evil, right? But you have Soren has his relationship with the Ribbon. You have the Theralon weapons from like Rualfo and stuff like that. Red Matter for Nero. All kinds of just, they have some kind of a super weapon, some kind of a WMD type thing. And that's the hint that, okay, this is just Khan, and, I would also say they kind of moved away from the emotion, the passion, the charisma that makes for really good villains. You know what I mean? When we talk about Krug, we'll come back to that, and General Chang. These both played by Christophers, actually, but they do a really, really good job. So in any case, without dwelling, I've already kind of beat this horse to death. The point is that they continuously try to reinvent this movie, to try to recapture the actual feelings and everything. And one of the reasons I don't think JJ's worked is that the feelings of deep friendship that obviously drove the Wrath of Khan were just non-existent. I mean, we hadn't been with that iteration of Kirk and that iteration of Spock, who early on really hated one another in the first film, to all of a sudden wonder why they're going to sacrifice one another or to one another, or why that's going to mean anything. And then the means of bringing them back, as harebrained as it is in Star Trek III, The Wrath of Khan, it's even more harebrained in Into Darkness. All right, I've spoken enough about JJ, so I'm going to move on. We're going to leap from 1982 forward a couple of years, right, to 1984 in Star Trek III, The Wrath of Khan. Now, keep in mind, it's up against some really tough competition. Not that they're in competition, but it's another good geek year. 1984. That's Ghostbusters. You know, that's and this is not a geek film, but Purple Rain came out in that year. You know what I mean? There's some heavy hitting films came out in that year. So why I really like Star Trek 3 is not just because it's a direct continuation of Star Trek 2 and the events in there, and it forms really the only Star Trek trilogy that we've got where the story is all one long story. And I would say it's almost one of the most Trek films out there. It is all about loyalty and friendship and sacrifice. And those are the themes that run through the film. And it's about the crew and about the ship. And that is at its core what Star Trek is about. You know, it's about the crew. It's about the ship. And the Voyage Home proves it's more about the crew, because they don't even have the Enterprise. And it's still very much a Star Trek film. So, like I said, we're not going to do a deep dive. I'm just going to do some like really quick, just kind of talking about some things that stood out to me. And I just recently binged watched all three films again, just all at once, just to see what jumped out at me and everything. So Star Trek 3, piggybacking on the success of Star Trek 2, obviously, but the studio is now really wanting to, you know, tighten the belts even more, have an even smaller budget. How much money can we save? You know, and Star Trek 2 had done really, really well. So, but they're still trying to save money. So a lot of stuff in Star Trek 3 winds up being redressed sets. Almost everything is shot on a soundstage. Almost everything, right? And it kind of tells when you watch now. Some of the shots at the Genesis planet don't kind of hold up. They would have been a little bit better, maybe shooting it on location. But, you know, it is actually completely in line with Star Trek, since almost every planet that they went to on the original show was a soundstage set. It wasn't on location, you know, because they couldn't afford it. So in a lot of ways, Star Trek 3 is a callback to the old Star Trek show. And they kind of don't let you forget it. And it's not, I guess today some folks would call it fan service, but I don't think it's fan service. And perhaps we need to stop and kind of define that term a little bit. The way I see it, fan service is throwing something in that only the fans would catch, right? That only the fans would catch, and it's there only to serve that purpose. Kind of to go, oh, the fans caught that and it's hilarious, or it's a moment that is that's the only purpose in the film it serves. And there's a couple of those in Avengers, but I don't want to talk about that yet since some folks may not have seen it. So I'm going to go to Rogue One, right? A textbook piece of fan service is they're on the planet, they're going around, they run into, like, I think the character's name is Dr. Erelon. It's the same guy who told Luke in Mos Eisley that he better watch himself, that he was wanted in 12 systems. So they wind up running into that guy on the street, and it means absolutely nothing to the story. It has, if you don't know who that character is, it means nothing. It kind of stops the story for a second. and yank some people out of the movie because you're like, hey, that's the guy from A New Hope, that was threatening Luke. That is what I would consider fan service. And there are moments of fan service in Star Trek 3. What I don't consider fan service is stuff that is in the continuity of the story that may not be essential to that particular story, but it taken as a whole, it's part of its internal consistency. It's part of that greater world building, and we'll talk about that more on a podcast about world building. But the big idea is when folks are not internally consistent within their story, that's when the people receiving the story, fans or not, become kind of irritated. If you take Game of Thrones for instance, you've got a situation where when the show started, it would take you weeks to go down the King's Road from Winterfell to King's Landing. By season 8, it's across the street. It's just like, hey, yeah, well, we're going to King's Landing. Do you want anything? We'll bring you a burger or something, right? And it's like, it started really a little bit earlier than that. Folks were making jokes that when you send a raven from Castle Black down to Dragonstone or whatever, it's like sending a tweet. It doesn't take days. It's just like a couple minutes. So that's a sign that internal consistency is starting to break down. And a lot of people were irritated by stuff like that. So what I mean by that is that when you introduce a factor in Star Trek 3 that Spock his cells have essentially cloned himself, regenerated all of his cells, and he is growing in spurts with the planet from really infancy to adulthood. That we know as Star Trek fans that the Vulcans go through this thing called Ponfar, which is kind of their mating season. They go into a kind of heat where they kind of lose their minds. If you don't address that, now you could not address that. It has nothing to do with the story, right? You could just blow right by that and most people wouldn't even catch it, but they didn't, right? They actually have Ponfar in there. They take it into account. There is a piece of fan service where they go into a bar and you see some people petting tribbles for like 2 seconds, right? And it has nothing to do with anything. But that's, that I would consider fan service. So there are a lot of things in Star Trek 3 that harken back directly to the original television show. And that's why I say Star Trek 3, it might be the most Star Trek of all the Star Trek films. You have a destruct sequence when they destroy the Enterprise. And I know I'm bouncing all over the place here, but we're not doing a deep dive. When they do the destruct sequence to destroy the Enterprise, that destruct sequence is nearly word for word the destruct sequence that is shown in Let That Be Your Last Battlefield episode of the original show. Ponfar, of course, is a concept introduced in Amok Time, one of the better episodes ever. There's stuff from Return to Tomorrow that talks about Vulcans and them not being, just corporeally confined, that they can kind of they're telepathic to the point that they may not be tied to their bodies. That's introduced in Return to Tomorrow. Of course, Sarek, Spock's father, is introduced in Journey to Babel, and they went and got Mark Leonard, the original actor who played his father, who had also played the Klingon commander of the Imperial cruiser Amar in Star Trek The Motion Picture, and he was also the Romulan commander Zenfrodicius in one of my favorite episodes, Balance of Terror, which of course introduced the cloaking device. They also introduce that the Klingons have a bird of prey, which is considered a Romulan ship, but that was talked about in the episode The Enterprise Incident, that the Klingons and the Romulans were trading tech and trading ships. And that's how Krug has a Klingon bird of prey. It's a Klingon variant of a Romulan ship equipped with a cloaking device, which was supposed to be only Romulan tech. So that's all stuff that ties directly in for Star Trek 3, which is just really, really cool. Of course, the studio wants lightning to strike twice, so they go after Harv Bennett and Nicholas Meyer again. Now, Meyer was kind of ticked off. He didn't like the way that they changed the ending to Star Trek 2. He didn't think that Spock should come back. He thought that was kind of a cheat, that it cheapened the events of Star Trek 2. And a lot of folks would agree with him, right? But you run into the problem that a lot of people adore Spock. He's one of the favorite characters ever. You want to find some kind of way to bring him back, especially when Leonard Nimoy now voices at that he's willing to come back and do stuff. Whereas at the beginning of Star Trek 2, Nimoy was not keen on reprising his role as the character. Now at the end, he's like, you know what? That wasn't as bad as I remember. That was a lot of fun. I would come back. So they had a bunch of contingency plans to try to do Spock as kind of a vision that Savick would interact with. There were stories of, he would be kind of a ghost. All kinds of different ideas that they had. Of course, Harv Bennett and Leonard Nimoy had come up with the whole Vulcan mind meld thing, which is the device that they used to bring him back in Star Trek 3. So Nicholas Meyer's out. So you're not going to have the same team. You have Harv Bennett, and you have now Leonard Nimoy wants to step up and direct this picture. So that's great. You have Leonard Nimoy coming back. You have Harv Bennett. Harv Bennett wrote the script. He did it in some remarkably fast way. He even commented that it was like one of the easiest scripts he'd ever written because he actually started from the last line of the script, which I think is Jim. Your name is Jim. He started there and then worked backwards. So it's actually really, really cool, but they get that. They get James Horner back, and they take on, when you watch Star Trek 2, it literally picks up immediately after Star Trek 2. It's not even immediately after Star Trek 2, it's during the end of Star Trek 2. And they start with something that is more of a television conceit, but the way they did it, it's really, really cool. You want to put the audience back in the feelings, in the emotional state that they were in at the end of Star Trek 2. So you want to pick up right from there, right? So they do this whole conceit from television where it's previously on Star Trek, but they didn't really do that. They just start with a desaturated, very small image of the end of Star Trek 2, where Kirk and Spock are talking to each other in between the glass. You see the death of Spock. It cuts to Kirk giving the eulogy at the funeral, and all this time, this image is getting bigger and bigger and bigger until at the end, by the end, it is taking over. It's taken over the entire screen, and they're leaching the color back in as you're getting closer and closer to current events, right? So Horner picks up with a theme. You hear Spock read the whole, prologue, the space, the final frontier, that thing. And then it shows the Genesis planet moves up into clouds and then moves back up into star fields. You get Kirk doing a captain's log conceit and saying, hey, this is where we're at. It's been a week or so since these events, and our cadet crew has mostly been reassigned, and we're heading back to Earth because we have to put in for space dock, right? So they do that, and there's some stuff that's going on. When they put back in, they're told that everyone's going to get commendations, and there's going to be shore leave, and good luck, except for Scotty. He's got to go fix the Excelsior. And then they get told that the Enterprise is not going to be refit. It's 20 years old. It's been beaten up. It's heavily damaged. At this point, the resources would be better used just getting a new ship, right? So rather than rebuilding it. And then they're told that Genesis is straight up off limits, right? And McCoy during this whole thing is kind of hallucinating and behaving like Spock. He's actually found in Spock's quarters telling Kirk to climb the steps of Mount Seleia, which is on Vulcan, and that plays a big role. They then have Sarek shows up later, and he tells, he admonishes Kirk, hey, why did you leave Spock on Genesis? Like he would have asked you, because he essentially in the Vulcan mysticism, when a Vulcan is going to die, they can go to Mount Seleia and they have some kind of brain repository kind of thing, where everybody can like basically meld with a higher consciousness and they don't lose all the information and stuff that they had. And so that's why he wants to climb the steps of Mount Seleia. Of course, they find out Kirk couldn't touch him. There's a great scene of acting here. And I know Shatner just catches a lot of hell for, but this scene is so subtle. There's Sarek is doubtful that of Kirk, and he wants to mind meld with him. So they mind meld, and Kirk is essentially reliving the death of Spock. And the way Nimoy shoots this, it's really in a series of tight close-ups, like super, super tight. Like all you see are people's lips. And one of those close-ups that he goes back to is Kirk's eye. It's just his eye and his eyebrow, right? And you can actually see his eye getting waterier, tearing up, as he's having to relive this. And I'm like, man, this is really good. And Shatner doesn't get credit for that kind of acting. He just gets mocked. And it's unfortunate because that's a really poignant moment and really subtle. And for me, the scene that defines this entire film is a sequence I will call Stealing the Enterprise, right? And it kind of starts with Kirk going to, I think it's Admiral Morrow, and asking, hey, we need to go back to Genesis. I need to go back. He tells Morrow, he's not trying to keep it secret. He's like, hey, there's a chance we can get Spock back. Like his dad, the Vulcan ambassador, came to talk to me. And it's amazing that like Starfleet would blow off the Vulcan ambassador, because I imagine that Sarek would have asked for permission to go to Genesis as well. And they kind of are like, no. And then they tell Kirk, they're just like, and this is another great moment of acting, I think. Morrow's just like, hey, I'm not, Genesis is off limits. I'm not letting you take a ship. You're not going there. You're not taking the crew. And once he says no, Kirk stops paying attention to him. And it's actually a really, really cool scene. Kirk is barely listening to what the Admiral's saying. He's staring off into space in another direction. And if you know Kirk, you're like, man, he's already 6 steps ahead. He's already coming up with a plan to go anyway, right? And Morrow finally, says, I'm sorry, you can't go. And he and Kirk snaps out of it and says, yeah, I had to try. You know what I mean? Whatever. And he's like, thanks for the drink, gets up. He runs into Sulu and Chekhov, and they're like, hey, what's the word? And he goes, the word is no. I, therefore, am going anyway. And it was just great, right? And he's like, I'm going to need your help. So everyone's just like chipping in. Then the sequence called Stealing the Enterprise is just absolutely fantastic. They bust McCoy out of kind of custody where he's being held by Starfleet security. And you get to see everybody has like their role on what they're supposed to do. Sulu does his thing. Chekhov does his thing. Scotty does his thing. Uhura does her thing. She kind of gets left behind, and it's unfortunate because she's just there in the movie, and it's almost a cameo. They really did Nichelle Nichols a disservice here. And the novelization holds a hint as to why. And I don't know if they filmed it and it was cut out of the film or not, but she is kind of in this like transporter room, and I'm going to assume it's in space dock, but it might not be in space dock. It might actually be on Earth, where they're just manning this, kind of backwater transporter station. And she tells Kirk all my hopes, and then they beam out, and you don't see her again until the end of the movie. In the novelization, she goes and jams all of like Starfleet communications for the entire like Earth sector. Like she is spoofing all their comms and everything, which is why nobody else except Excelsior chases the Enterprise. So it's kind of a really important thing, and I wish they would have shown that's what Uhura was doing, which is why she's not on the ship with everyone else, is that she had to stay behind to jam all the comms and everything and spoof everything so that people wouldn't be able to mount a pursuit of the Enterprise as fast as they could. So it's unfortunate that they got left out. A couple other things that this movie should be notable for. One, we see some Starfleet security guys wearing phaser-proof armor. And I think this is the first movie that ever shows that. It also depicts Klingons as that kind of Klingon mail that they're wearing is also kind of phaser-proof. Not entirely, because we see a Klingon get disintegrated by a disruptor when he violates, Krug's orders and blows up the USS Grissom. And Krug kills his gunner because he wanted prisoners. But there's also a scene where Kirk shoots one of the Klingons and it blasts the guy backwards. It doesn't kill him. It like blasts him across the thing into a bunch of rocks, and he's not dead. So they are somewhat phaser resistant, and maybe not to disruptors. The other thing that's kind of neat about this, and it's unacknowledged, right, is that one of the things was that Harv Bennett really wanted it to be about the Romulans, hence the Romulan bird of prey, the cloaking device, all that stayed in the script. They changed it to be the Klingons because they felt they were more iconic, right? They were more iconic. More people knew about the Klingons than the Romulans as far as like pop culture, general audiences went. So they went with the Klingons. So they cast Christopher Lloyd as Krug, this Klingon commander. And the way he gets played, he's very, very passionate, but he is not this great commander. He is not this great leader. He is kind of this dude. He is in charge of a bird of prey. Sulu at one point in the film says that crew complement of the bird of prey is a dozen men. It's a dozen Klingons, right? So this is like a scout ship. It is by no means something that should be going up against a heavy cruiser, which shows just how insane Krug is as far as trying to get Genesis. He's trying to make his bones. He is not on a secret mission for the Klingon Empire. He is trying to, if he has Genesis, he will be somebody. And that's his entire motivation. Now, he is incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I would give it that he's incredibly brave. And one of the reasons I would say that is when he he orders his crew, he's like, get the crew together and get a boarding party, and we're going to go over there and take over the Enterprise. His second in command says, we'll be outnumbered. His answer is, we are Klingons. Like, that's it. Like, we're Klingons, they're humans, a dozen of us can take over their whole ship. He is very confident in their combat abilities and what they can do. He also has like kind of some weird habits that they put in there. He has this like pet dog Targ thing that is kind of an overgrown puppet. It hasn't really aged well as far as the film goes. But he's into pets. And so when he goes down to to the Genesis surface and he sees these kind of microbes that have evolved on Spock's caskets, and they're now these big like worm things, he picks one up to try to see like, hey, is this something I could like take back? And it attacks him and he winds up killing it. But his initial motivation is just like, hey, this is cool. Like, can I take it back? So it's just kind of neat. The other thing that is really neat is that the modern concept of the Klingon, and when I say modern, I mean post-1969, concept of the Klingon really came out of Star Trek 3. There were some Klingon words that showed up before in Star Trek the Motion Picture at the beginning, but really not an entire language. And Mark Okrand built a Klingon English dictionary with and in the acknowledgments at the beginning he says thank you Maltz, right? So Maltz is one of the junior officers that is left behind on the Klingon bird of prey. He's played by John Larroquette from Night Court. It's actually kind of funny. Who is basically unrecognizable underneath all the Klingon makeup. But yeah, so he created this entire language, like an actual language where they could talk. And this is lost on a lot of people. There's 2 languages they speak on the Klingon bird of prey. They speak English and they speak Klingon. And the Klingon is all subtitled, so you can understand it. And the English obviously doesn't need to be. Now you can look at it as a conceit that just to make things easier to understand, the Klingons are going to speak English like every other sci-fi show, right? So the audience can understand what's going on. I would argue, then why create the Klingon? Why create even go to greater lengths and talk about Klingon battle language, which is kind of a slang version of Klingon that they only use in battle. It's much more clipped and short, so you can give commands, right? It's not as elaborate. All this comes out of Star Trek 3. Well, this is a really subtle thing. It's Krug speaks English to his officers. He directs the crew in Klingon. And so when he's talking about Genesis and he's wanting his officers' opinions on what they see, those conversations are all in English. But then when he's giving orders about, hey, kill one of them, I don't care which, or, target the engine only, I want prisoners, where he's talking to his crew, he gives those commands in Klingon. And so it's just a really, really subtle distinction there that I think a lot of the other films lacked or didn't use or didn't pick up on. But it is actually really, really cool. So Kirk suffers even heavier losses in this film. He's lost Spock. He loses David. David gets killed by the Klingons. And then he loses the love of his life, the Enterprise. He has to give up the Enterprise to get a fighting chance to live. They wind up taking over the Klingon ship, getting rid of everybody except Maltz. The famous kind of joke, because Maltz is like, I do not deserve to live. This movie also introduced the whole honor culture of the Klingons. That they had an honor culture. Sometimes it showed up in. I think in Errand of Mercy, that's one of the ones where the Klingon and Kirk is talking. They're talking about going to war or whatever, and the Klingon says something like, "It's too bad that they've canceled our war. It would have been glorious," And you get a hint that he's part of this like whole honor culture thing. But Star Trek 3 really hammers that down, and they're able to return Spock's Katra to his new cloned body, which is now conveniently aged in spurts with Genesis to be like Leonard Nimoy's age. So everything's kind of back to normal, which is a little bit disappointing because it does kind of cheapen Spock's sacrifice from Star Trek 2, but it's the direction the franchise was going to go. So, which brings me now to Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, right? So we've come kind of full circle, where the crew is back, right? The crew is back together. They're ready to go. Next adventure, right? So we now get Harve Bennett and Nicholas Meyer. Nicholas Meyer's back, right? He was the director of Star Trek 2, if you'll recall, and Leonard Nimoy. So they get this story together. This is now 1986, okay? And the studio is still wanting to save more money, right? We need to squeeze every dime we can. Star Trek 3 did very well in the theater as well, but they just want, we can tighten down these budgets. We can make more and more money, right? So Harv Bennett had kind of felt that after the last two movies, the audiences had been put through kind of a ringer, right? You have a lot of emotion going on in Star Trek 3, in Star Trek 2 and in Star Trek 3. And this time he wanted this to just be fun, just a fun adventure, a reward to the audience, adds in very light film. So they're going to go for a lot of humor. Oh, and before I go too far into Star Trek 4, I forgot to mention that the theme in Star Trek 2 is very much about growing old, growing too old in the life that has passed you by, and regret, right? That's kind of the themes that run through Star Trek 2, age versus youth, experience versus inexperience, that kind of thing. Star Trek 3, if that's Star Trek 2, is about facing your kind of midlife crisis, Star Trek 3 is about accepting that you're middle-aged. At the time it came out, people were already talking about how the crew was getting too old. They were talking about, hey, they're aging, they're getting fat, they're not being able to do all the same stuff that they could do before. At this point, I think most of them were in their late 40s, if not 50s. So they're not entirely wrong, but obviously when you're looking at a story from that point of view, it is different than if you have a bunch of 20-somethings running the crew, So that was something that was in the kind of the back of Paramount's mind already, that, hey, the crew is getting old and we need new blood and kind of all this stuff. But the fans were growing with the crew. So Star Trek 3 is very much about accepting your age, accepting that, hey, I've reached middle age and it's not all that bad. And so we see some indications of that. We see there's a guy who's credited as Mr. Adventure who's talking to Uhura, and he kind of makes this comment because he's commenting on how terrible their assignment is, because they're in this transporter room where they're never going to see any action. It's like either on space dock or on Earth. So they're not getting any action or anything. And he makes some comment about maybe that's okay for you, for somebody like you whose career is winding down, right? Of course, the ship is being decommissioned. And then Morrow brings it up, man, the Enterprise is 20 years old. Well, it's really kind of older than that. If they count, the Robert April and Pike and all the other stuff that went on. So it's kind of telling that's another age thing. When Sulu goes in and he's trying to make small talk with like a security guard, and the security doesn't not know it's Captain Sulu. He just knows it's some guy. And so he's like yawning, and Sulu says something like, hey, keeping you busy? And he's like, don't get smart, tiny. Right. And of course, Sulu just beats his ass later. So, but that's kind of a ongoing theme throughout the film, is that it's just like, okay, you guys are discounting these folks because they're older, but with age comes wisdom, and experience. And oh, by the way, if they want to steal the Enterprise, you're not going to stop them. These guys, this crew, have done the impossible for a long time. Stealing the Enterprise when you're not even trying to kill them, that's a piece of cake. And I do want to talk about another piece of acting before we jump back to Star Trek 4, and it's of Captain Styles, right? So Captain Styles is a captain who is the captain of the Excelsior. He's kind of in charge of going to do the shakedown cruise, and he's the captain of the Excelsior when Kirk and company steal the Enterprise, right? So they show him, and this guy does not get a lot of screen time, right? And I really like what this actor did. And I want to, his name eludes me right now, but I want to say he was from Hill Street Blues. He was another television actor. What he did on screen with very little time and not a whole lot of exposition is actually brilliant, right? So he is laying down and filing his fingernails. Well, first of all, who files their fingernails while they're laying down? And like the filings are landing on his chest. I'm like, what are you doing, right? So they get this alert and it says yellow alert, yellow alert. And he kind of smugly reaches over to the comm unit and he punches it with his nail file, right? Like disdainfully. He just kind of goes click and then smugly, Bridge, how can we have a yellow alert while we're in space dock? And the guy comes back, Captain, somebody is stealing the Enterprise. He's like, I'll be right there. Then he reaches over and grabs a swagger stick. Like, could this guy be a bigger idiot, right? Like a complete jerk. He grabs a swagger stick. Like, you're going to have a swagger stick on a starship in the 23rd century. And so it's all these little things add up to make him instantly unlikable. And he does a really, really good job. He's not a villain, right? But he's just kind of this smug jerk, and you just want to see him get his comeuppance. So by the end, when they're closing onto the Enterprise and about to turn on the tractor beam, and he comes across the comm, and again, very smug tone, right? Because he's like, if they try to get away with warp drive, they're in for a shock, right? Because he's in the Excelsior, and it's got transwarp, and it's gonna do wonders, right? And he comes across the comm and he says, Kirk, if you do this, you'll never sit in the captain's chair again. And there's no hesitation from Kirk. Kirk just goes, warp speed, and they're gone, right? And because he already knows the Excelsior is sabotaged, it's not going anywhere. And this guy winds up with egg on his face. And of course, there's nobody else chasing him because Uhura is doing her job, jamming all the comms. Which, of course, they don't show in the film. But anyway, I wanted to make sure we talked about that. And we're going to jump back to Star Trek IV now, right? So Harve Bennett, Nicholas Meyer, and Leonard Nimoy have decided that they're going to make this a reward kind of film. It's going to be a very light film. It's not going to have the heavy themes that the last two films had. And it's going to be a lot of humor. And we see in this film the kind of prototype for future films like Guardians of the Galaxy, right? Where you know these characters and they establish these characters very quickly, but you know these characters. So it's really, really, really funny when they do something either completely in character or completely out of character. And they play off of that a lot. And this is a film that is all about the crew. It is truly an ensemble film. Everybody has a mission. And if anyone's mission fails, the entire endeavor falls apart. And that's what I really love about The Voyage Home. Harve Bennett and Nicholas Meyer wrote the script, and I believe that it was written in kind of a haphazard way where Harve Bennett wrote all the parts that took place in the 23rd century, and Nicholas Meyer wrote all the parts that took place in the 80s. So it's just kind of a little bit crazy. This is 86 at this point. And they were not able to get James Horner to come back. So they got Leonard Rosenman to come back. He had long time guy. He had done the music for Fantastic Voyage, for Planet of the Apes. And most telling, especially with this film, the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings. And if you watch Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, even just for a moment, and then watch Star Trek for The Voyage Home, the themes sound very, very close. Really, really close. And one of the cool things that they telegraph right at the beginning, this is going to be fun, right? So Star Trek 2 started with the music, and the credit opening scenes started with like this keening note sound, right? Very ominous. And then just dumped you right into the Kobayashi Maru. Star Trek 3 starts very somber, with the with Spock reading the prologue, and then we go into James Horner's kind of a very melodic orchestral Genesis theme that is now like the opening theme of Star Trek 3. And Star Trek 4 starts with the Alexander Courage, Star Trek theme that we all know, right? And then they actually beam the titles onto the screen, Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, and then the music just hits you, and it is orchestral, but it is not like ominous. It is not like somber. It is really just bouncy. It is it's telling you, it's making you a promise. Hey, this is going to be fun. Like, strap in. You're going to be laughing your way through this. And it really, really just really, really helps. They bring in one of the really telltale signs that shows the direction they wanted to go is, we all know by now, Jillian is the whale biologist that they run into. That part was originally scheduled for Eddie Murphy. So that gives you an idea of the tonal shift that they were aiming for. Of course, Eddie Murphy really hot off of his stand-up specials, Beverly Hills Cop, all kinds of stuff like that. So he was a real hot commodity, and he chose, and I don't know, I'm kind of torn about this. I'm like, I don't know how an Eddie Murphy Star Trek movie would play, to be honest. I don't know how that would have worked. A part of me really, really wants to have seen that film, but Eddie wanted to be either an alien or a Starfleet officer. He didn't want to be like a normal guy, and they were going to play him as he was a college professor, an astrophysicist or something, but from the 80s, and he didn't really want to play kind of the guy from the 80s. So he didn't take the part, and he went and did the Golden Child instead. And I think that was, he has acknowledged in hindsight that was a mistake, but it is one of those things that you're like, oh man, well, somewhere out there in the multiverse, there is a Star Trek 4 Eddie Murphy film, right? So I guess we can take some solace in that. Now, and there's not a whole lot to really talk about with Star Trek 4. It kind of is what it is. It is a fish out of water adventure with an ensemble cast, and you know the whole cast and you know what they're supposed to do. And it has some laughs that are played sometimes a little bit cheaply. The scene I'm thinking of, there's a scene where they send Uhura and Chekhov, and they're trying to, the Klingon dilithium crystals are basically losing their integrity, and they need some radiation to like force to, they can pass it back through the dilithium crystals and kind of like re-energize them. And so of course they're like, well, these guys, there's nuclear power all over the place in the end of the 20th century, so we can just go in there. And they decide that they're going to go to the reactor of an aircraft carrier. And of course it's the Enterprise. Now in actuality, I think it was the USS Ranger, because Enterprise was at sea. But it's, pretty cool. So of course, who do you pick to send? You send the Russian guy, right, to infiltrate the carrier. So it's obviously kind of funny, because you go, well, by the 23rd century, they didn't even think. They're so far beyond the idea of the whole nations and all this stuff that they didn't think that, hey, wait a minute, in the late 20th century, sending the Russian guy to go to a U.S. aircraft carrier, probably not the smartest thing. And there's a scene where Chekhov and Uhura are kind of on a street corner, and they filmed it with hidden cameras. And there was a rumor for a long time that the people that they're interacting with didn't know that they were in the movie, but Hollywood doesn't work that way. Like, if you're on screen, you're paid extra, and if you have a line, you're like member of the Screen Actors Guild or something like that. So I'm pretty sure that's not true, but they did use hidden cameras to give you this kind of idea that it was like on the street, the man on the street kind of thing, where Chekhov and Uhura are asking where the naval base is, and in Alameda. And it's just kind of, part of it makes sense, because you're like, okay, they could be in San Francisco and not know how to get to Alameda, but that's not what they're asking. They're kind of like, can you tell me where the naval vessels are in Alameda? And some folks would point out, and I would be one of them, that all of them went to Starfleet Academy, which is in San Francisco. So you'd know where Alameda was, So granted, the layout of the city might have changed and you might not know how to get to Alameda, but you know where it is. So that was just kind of, it was played up for laughs. Didn't kind of work. There's a scene that I surprised myself when I was watching it. I laughed out loud several times. It was really, really funny. And it's when Spock and Kirk are getting a lift from Jillian. And she's talking about hard luck cases. And Kirk is trying to play Spock off as like having been to Berkeley and doing too much LDS because he messes up he doesn't know the whole history. And keep in mind that of the crew, Kirk and Spock are the closest to knowing what's going on because of the events that happened in the city on the edge of forever, right? So they've been back in time in the 20th century before. So they have a little bit more savvy than everybody else, even though it wasn't particularly this exact time. That entire scene is just hilarious because they've just started talking about Spock not being able to lie. And then Kirk tries to make this cover story why Spock is so weird. They get into the car and Jillian's just trying to make conversation. She turns to Spock and goes, "So you were at Berkeley?" And Spock immediately just goes, "I was not." And it's just it's hilarious. The way they play that entire scene, it is really, really funny. And it's something that you could see in a modern film like Guardians of the Galaxy. Where they're it's not a comedy, but it kind of is a comedy. A couple other things to point out is that Kirk, even though he does try to turn on the charm for Jillian, he's never trying to like hit on her or pick her up. He's turning on the charm because he needs to get the information from her. Like, hey, when are the whales leaving or whatever. And at the end of the film, he does look a little bit hurt because even though he hasn't turned on the charm, it's like the mission's over. Everything has kind of worked out. And Jillian's now in the 23rd century. And he goes, "Hey, how will I find you? In your time, I don't even have, as your time would say, I don't even have your phone number." And she says, "Don't worry about that. I'll find you." And he's like, Kirk is completely shot down. But it's another example that just shows that this idea that Kirk is this like ladies' man that just sleeps around with everything that has been carried forward into pop culture is absolutely not true. It's unwarranted. And the same with the whole idea that Kirk breaks rules like all the time. He really doesn't. He does it when Spock's life is on the line. One of the examples is that he ignored higher regulations or higher orders and regulations in Amok time because Spock's life was on the line. So he diverted the Enterprise, right? And again, he steals the Enterprise and does everything that he does in Star Trek 3 to save Spock. He's not just breaking rules willy-nilly because he feels like it. And we'll talk about my headcanon stuff a little bit later in the episode. There are a couple of things that I want to point out that were cut out of the film or are hard to notice in the film, so you wouldn't kind of see it unless you knew to look at it. And one of them is the scene at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And actually, I got to take a quick aside here. The Monterey Bay Aquarium was used as the Cetacean Institute, and it's supposed to be in Sausalito in the film. So I had a weird experience with that because we were in Monterey, went to the aquarium. They had this whole exhibit on jellyfish. I walked in there and I got the strangest sense of deja vu I'd ever had in my life. I was just like, I know I've been here before. And my wife was just kind of like, "No, we've never been here before, obviously." I'm like, "I know that, but I know if you go through these doors right here, there's like a U-shaped thing with an enclosure." And she was just like, "What?" And so we walk out those doors and there's this U-shaped thing, but there's like no enclosure there. There's no, and I was like, "Man, I don't know why I thought that." And she's like, "Oh, you probably saw a place something similar." And it took me all day until I was like, hey, wait a minute. This is the Cetacean Institute in Sausalito in Star Trek 4. That's why I knew that's the enclosure where George and Gracie were. So it was just kind of funny. Funny aside story there. But in the scene where Spock jumps in and swims with the whales to mind meld, there's a scene before that where they've just gotten money. Kirk has pawned his glasses that were gifts from Dr. McCoy, the one with the broken lenses, right? So he's pawned it to get like $100, so they have some money. They tried to get on a bus, and then they walk off, and Spock is like, what does it mean, exact change? So in the book, they go into just like a convenience store, and they're just trying to break the money that they have, so they buy some candy. And if I remember right, it was a peppermint patty, but like the product placement like fell through with the film. So that scene never made it into the movie. But the idea behind it was that sugar affects Vulcans differently than it does humans, and it makes them kind of drunk. So when Spock jumps into the tank to mind meld, that's part of the reason he's acting so weird is that he's kind of drunk for a Vulcan because he's had all this sugar from the York peppermint patty. So that's just a fun fact, piece of trivia. For the prop whore people out there, when they show Starfleet Command and they get, they're getting the transmissions from everybody, all the distress calls from the probe is evaporating Earth's oceans and everything. There is a kind of table that has a bunch of monitors on it, like embedded in the table. And the nickname for that table became the pool table. And that prop wound up being the central console of the Enterprise D's engine room. Whenever you saw Geordi or whatever, there would be this table in the middle of engineering, and you could see the warp core behind it. That's that same table. It was reused from Star Trek 4 through all of the Next Generation on the Enterprise D. So that's just kind of cool. And also the whole idea that Paramount was aware that the crew was getting old, right? And their salaries were starting to demand more money, right? Is they're just like, oh man, I think Nimoy and Shatner both got $2.5 million or whatever in 1986 dollars to be in that movie. So the studio is well aware that, hey, these guys are starting to command some really big salaries that are chunks of the budget. So that was a big driving force behind Star Trek The Next Generation, which is 1987. So all this ties in, and what's really neat about Star Trek 4 is if you look at some of the credits and if you study some of the making of and everything, the names start carrying over from ILM and Paramount into the folks that worked on Star Trek The Next Generation. Most notably, Michael Okuda, who made all the Klingon displays and everything. He is known for the Okudagrams. He is known for the library computer archival retrieval system, the LCAR system that you see in Next Generation all over the place. So it is really, really cool. The other cool thing about Star Trek 4 is it also showcased the first female captain actually in command on her bridge. And it is the USS Saratoga. I don't know the captain's name, but she's actually one of the first people you see when they run into the probe. She's like, hey, we're trying to communicate with this probe and we're trying to monitor it and everything. That's one of the first people you see. Again, Star Trek 4 plays into stuff that was established in previous Trek lore. Again, not fan service, right? The slingshot effect of going around the sun to achieve time warp was established in, I'm going to lose some cred here. It's either Tomorrow is Yesterday or Assignment Earth. It might actually be both. but both those episodes had time travel in them, and I don't remember which one. I should probably just stop and go and look it up, but we're just going to press. And it has one of the best examples of hanging a lantern on something. Now, the term hanging a lantern is when it is some kind of inconsistency or something that is kind of absurd in the story, and you have one of the characters pointed out so that the audience knows, like, it's not an oversight. It's not a plot hole. It's, that this is insane and just go with it, right? Because otherwise the story is not going to work. And it has, Star Trek 4 has probably one of the best hanging a lantern moments in it. And it has some great deliveries, and it's from Dr. McCoy. And the scene that I'm talking about it starts a little earlier than the hang the lantern moment. It starts when Spock says, that he just finished giving them a small lecture on humpback whales are the only creature that could answer this probe. They're indigenous to Earth, and they're extinct, right? And so they're the only ones that can answer the probe, and so they're kind of hosed. They're not on any other planet or anything. So Kirk says, we have to destroy the probe or whatever. And Spock says, no, that won't work. I mean, it's incapacitating the entire planet. We're not even going to get close enough to it to use weapons. So Kirk's like, well, what's your suggestion? And Spock says, we attempt to get humpback whales. And McCoy's interaction on that is great because he thinks he's caught Spock in some kind of a logical, an intellectual fallacy. And he goes, wait a minute, you just said that humpback whales were extinct, that they didn't exist except on Earth of the past. And Spock goes, you're correct, Doctor. That's exactly what I said. And then McCoy is just like, but that's it. Now wait just a damn minute, because he knows exactly what Kirk is going to do. And Kirk says, begin your computations for time warp. They start walking out, and McCoy's protesting. And in his protests, they lay out the entire plot of the film for the general audience and hang a lantern on it. He says, you propose that we go back in time, find a pair of humpback whales, bring them back forward in time, and hope that they tell this probe what to do with itself? And Kirk goes, yeah. And he goes, well, that's crazy because it's absolutely insane. But once McCoy has pointed that out, the audience is along for the ride. You're just like, okay, we can acknowledge that this is a bonkers plan and that this is going to be kind of a madcap adventure, but we don't need to be locked into the hard science of it and why that is completely improbable or wouldn't work, right? And that's a really good thing. There's a couple of other scenes in there. There's a scene where Sulu was supposed to run into one of his ancestors. It's the scene where they're in San Francisco and they're actually looking for a place that could manufacture a substitute to transparent aluminum. And also in the movie, when Scotty goes to the place with transparent aluminum, he gives the guy the recipe for transparent aluminum, and he turns to McCoy because McCoy is showing concern, saying, hey, aren't we changing time by giving this guy this tech like now? And then Scotty says in the film, how do we know he didn't invent the thing, right? In the novelization, he actually knew that the guy invented the thing. So he's not violating time. It's like he was just giving it to him, which is, of course, what would have happened. Otherwise, Scotty wouldn't know that guy invented the thing. So it's just kind of, time travel, all kinds of stuff gets messed up. At the end, they, all the charges are dropped. Everybody is happy because they saved Earth. There's a couple of things that are conveniently forgotten to keep the light tone of the film. At the beginning, the Klingon ambassador is ranting about Kirk being a renegade and a terrorist, and how, David, Kirk's own son, is the one who developed Genesis, and Kirk is trying to take out the entire Klingon people. And he says something storming out. He says there will be no peace as long as Kirk lives. And that is basically just like not addressed at all anymore. So at the end of the film, all the charges are dropped. Kirk is reduced in rank from admiral to captain and given command of the starship, and they're all assigned to a new ship. And this is something that, we could say is maybe unique to Starfleet, but it's definitely a problem with Star Trek where the same crew winds up being together for forever. right? And that's it is an artifact of television and of, of these kinds of stories. It's like The Next Generation. You very rarely see anybody actually move on to a different post. But if you're kind of paying attention, when they get reassigned to the new ship at the end, you have 3 captains, right? You have Kirk, Spock, and Sulu, and 4 commanders, all assigned to the same ship. So it's a very top-heavy ship. And you could almost say that this is like Starfleet going, you know what? These guys saved the planet. Let's just give them a ship and get them out of our hair. And they give them a refit USS Enterprise, which starts the entire NCC 1701A through B through C through D. That starts with this film. At the end of the film, they get the new Enterprise. Everyone's happy. And I remember seeing this in the theater and just about bursting into tears because their little shuttle that they're in is heading directly for Excelsior. And I was just like, oh, it's going to be on the Excelsior now, right? And then the shuttle kind of pops up over the Excelsior and you see the dish, and it's NCC 171A. The entire theater absolutely went berserk when that happened. And very wisely, Nimoy chooses to end the film. I think it's maybe 20 seconds, not even. After you see that NCC 171A, it shows it clearing space dock on a new bridge, and Kirk just says, okay, let's see what she's got. And it shows it rocketing off into warp. You get the really upbeat music, credits, right? And it's awesome. And it left Star Trek in a really, really good place. The Next Generation came on a year later. I think that's what Star Trek should be about. It should be about optimism, right? It should be about future stuff. When I was in the Bard's Tower, I was speaking with Jonathan Mayberry, and we were talking about optimistic kind of future stuff because there's not a whole lot out there. There's Star Trek. Star Trek is your optimism thing that says that, hey, not only will the human race still be around and we'll still be humans, but we'll be better off than we were before. And unfortunately, a lot of that veneer has come off. And regrettably, some of that has been, Star Trek went to a very, very bad place after Enterprise got canceled. I mean, it was just kind of gone off television. And now it's coming back in a really, really big way. We've, of course, got Star Trek Discovery. And I will, full confession here, I have only seen 2 episodes of Star Trek Discovery, and I liked what I saw except for the Klingons. Couldn't stand the Klingons, and I guess that's tied to some kind of a legal problem with Paramount or something as to why the Klingon designs are so radically different. But I love that they were speaking in Klingon in all the scenes, but it just seemed like the poor actors couldn't even emote or breathe under all the masks and makeup and stuff. There's a new show coming out called Lower Decks, Star Trek Lower Decks, which is going to be an animated show. And I guess they've got one of the showrunners from Rick and Morty to run that. So it's meant to be kind of a comedy about what happens to kind of the lower people underneath. My guess is it's probably going to be heavily influenced by Red Shirts by John Scalzi, which was, people are not, it's not fanfic, but it is fanfic. And if you enjoy Star Trek stories that don't take themselves entirely seriously, check out that book. And then they're also doing a kids show on Nickelodeon. That's an untitled Star Trek kids show. They have Michelle Yeoh doing a Section 31 show. Section 31 is kind of the spec ops, kind of the dark side of Starfleet. The guys that will do whatever it takes to keep the peace. There is another show in the works called Starfleet Academy that is apparently going to be, more teen-oriented. Kind of thing of what it's like to go through Starfleet Academy. And then the big dog that everyone's looking forward to is a show called Picard. Although it is associated with Alex Kurtzman, so I don't know, but it's going to star Patrick Stewart and take up, I guess, in the original continuity, not the. I don't know if it will be Discovery continuity. If it will, I know it's not the Kelvin timeline, which is effectively dead now, which was the JJ Trek. So that's kind of interesting. For my money, the best Star Trek show on television out there. Now, keep in mind, I haven't watched Discovery, but my favorite show out there for Star Trek is The Orville. I think they've actually captured a very next generation feel Star Trek show. How they're getting away with it, I don't know. The legalities behind that, but it just seems like they throw in a couple of jokes and then they're good to go. I mean, there are episodes that are every bit as good as some of those episodes from Star Trek The Next Generation. And the fan films, there was Star Trek Continues, and I can't hype this show enough. It's all on YouTube or Vimeo. You can find it. These guys recreated the look of the 1960s show and essentially made the 4th and 5th seasons of Star Trek. And the principal guy behind it is Vic Mignogna. He does some of he's a voice actor for like Dragon Ball and Inuyasha, but he plays Kirk. He does a fantastic job. They got some really, really good actors. James Doohan's son plays Scotty and does an outstanding job. They rebuilt all the sets and everything. It's just absolutely gorgeous. It kind of got the kibosh, but they were able to finish at least their arc, and bring it in with. I'm sorry, I had to pause there, but they were able to bring it in all the way up to Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So they have a transition there. It's a really, really good show. And then there was Star Trek Axanar, which caused a lot of problems. There was a whole lawsuit and everything like that. And Paramount came out with some rules, and I guess CBS as well, the rights owners for Trek, about fan productions and what they're limited to do now and how everything has to be licensed and not more than 15 minutes long. So I think that's going to stifle a lot of the fan projects that were out there, because there were, Star Trek New Voyages, there were a lot of other stuff, and original cast members had shown up on a lot of these shows. So it's unfortunate, but that's where it is. I'm excited to see where they go with new Star Trek, and I think I'm just going to leave it there. So until next time, this is Mike, out.
Couldn't keep us from the sea. Here we stand, open arms. This is home where we are, ever strong in the world that we made. I still hear you in the breeze, see your shadows in the trees, holding on, memories never change.
You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.